Hello, this is a quick video to walk you through the intro to Ableton. If you're looking to create music, but start off in a pretty simple way without overcomplicating it, you just want to dive straight in. Hopefully this will give you the tools that you need to just be able to start making stuff. Ideally, you've got access to this software in a space where you also have access to some sort of MIDI keyboard, but one of the benefits of Ableton is you can use your computer, your QWERTY keyboard, to control some sounds on there as well. Only limitation is you can't get as creative or as in-depth with the sounds just as you're playing them, but you can always edit them in the software later on. So there's some options. Cool. So I'm going to open up a introductory. This is what will your Ableton session will look like most of the time when you open it up for a blank session. By default as well, it'll normally open up the first time with a template session, so you can have a play around in there. It's got like someone else's whole track in there, which is kind of cool. But if you're loading it up and you get a blank session, this is what you'll be starting with. This window here, one cool little thing. You've got this little info view down here. If that little arrow down in that corner is popped up, then you should be able to see that. I would highly suggest that while you're learning, because anytime you hover over anything, it'll start to give you an indication of what that thing is. So right now, if I'm looking at this window, if I go over to these little lines on the side here, you'll see that I'm currently in, if we look down in that bottom corner of the info, it says that we're in our session view. And if I click the one above that, it says it'll take us to our arrangement view. And this is where we can start putting audio files in, or MIDI clips and those sort of things. Key difference is we have audio tracks here and we have MIDI tracks ready to get you set up. The most stripped back version of an explanation for this is an audio track is something that we're going to record a physical audio file onto. So we're going to work with physical audio. So by that I mean a clip that has been recorded. For example, if I was recording my voice right now and this was coming into this track, that would be being captured as an audio file. Same as if you like plug a guitar in, you plug something in where we're actually just recording the output of a sound source. MIDI is a little bit different. MIDI is essentially like a digital trigger, a digital signal that we can then put different instruments on top of. So if I play a whole heap of notes on my keyboard, I could then make that sound like a piano, or sound like a guitar, or an organ, or whatever you want it to be. And MIDI is essentially your trigger values, the things that are going to say, hey, play it this loud, play this particular note, and then you can play around and make it sound like whatever you want, even drums. So we're going to look at both of those, but first thing that we're going to do is just get familiar with the workspace. So tracking things in and placing stuff along this timeline. First of all, you can see up here, by default, we have our bars. So this is currently bar 1, bar 2, bar 3, bar 4, and then start in bar 5. So we're working in currently 4/4 timing, which is really useful. So you've got your meters up here. Down the bottom, we've got minutes and seconds. So you've got 15 seconds, 30 seconds, etc. Up at the top, there's a couple of really useful things. This is your beats per minute, your tempo. So how many beats are we working with? If we're working with something that's 80 beats per minute, BPM, if I just click and drag down, or if I click into here and type, I can place a tempo in there. But just to hear what that sounds like, this little 2 dots here, this is your metronome, the thing that's going to click and create those beats. So if I just do that and now press spacebar, cool. So you can see that timeline's rolling, and I can listen to that tempo or turn it off. If I want to make that slower, let's put it on. Let's bring it down. So you can get an idea for how that would work. So you can set the tempo. I would suggest you set the tempo to at least roughly what you might want to create. Right at the start does make things easier, because then you're lining everything up to the grid. But Ableton's really useful so that if you compose something or you make something really, really fast, and then you go, this would actually be way cool to slow down, you can slow it down and it'll slow those audio files and those MIDI clips down with you. Always nice to get starting roughly in the ballpark though. Okay, so first things first, if we just talk about the windows here, these are our tracks. Key things on these, you have these little selectors where they're already set up and like a yellowy orange color. That means that those tracks are active. If I click them and make them gray, those tracks are now inactive. So you can kind of think like that's kind of like your on and off switch for the track. Do you want to hear it? Do you not? The one next to it, the S, is your solo. So you can solo a track, or if you hold down Command, you can solo multiple tracks together, which is really useful. Maybe you've got lots of tracks, you've got vocals and drums and bass and guitars, but you want to hear all of your drum elements together, or your drums and your bass together. That way you can solo a couple. The little dot on the side, that is our record enable button, and that allows us to arm recording, get it ready to actually listen to sound coming in. We also have the options for where we want the sound coming in and out. If you're working with an external interface, like I've got a little interface on the side here that allows me to plug my microphone in, then I would be going with an external input, but a lot of those settings can also come in your preferences up in here. You see here at the moment, because I'm streaming, I'm doing it a little bit weird, but I have lots of different options. So I could be recording from the built-in microphone in my computer. At the moment, I normally would use my little interface, and I've got a weird kind of output so that it's working correctly as I'm streaming, but just double check those settings in there if you can't hear anything or if you can't get any signal coming in. Sample rate is probably something you don't really need to worry about if you're just first starting out and learning. 48,000 is how many samples you're taking per second. That's all you need to know right now. The more samples you take, it's like pixels in a camera, the bigger the file size will be. So 48 is totally fine. This down here is important. Right now, so that there's less lag while I'm streaming, I have given myself a bigger buffer size. If you are pressing a note on your keyboard and it's taking a bit too long for you to actually hear the sound come back out of your computer, you probably want to jump in here and change this to a smaller value. This is essentially like how many samples out of that 48,000 are we giving the computer to figure its stuff out before it plays that sound back again. So the shorter that amount of time is, the quicker it'll pump it out. So 32 samples is a way quicker time frame than 1,024, but it does mean I'm making my computer work harder. So there might be glitches or things that freak out. And that's also a really useful thing to know, because this little guy up here, Ableton gives you a built-in CPU meter, your central processing unit for your computer. So it tells you how much you're overloading it. If that's up in the red, kind of cranking around 70-80%, good chance is that your audio is going to be sounding a little bit crunchier than it's meant to. So just double check that. You can adjust it in your buffer size. On the other window over here, if I load this one up, if you've used other DAWs before, so Pro Tools, Logic, even Audacity or something like that, you'd normally be presented with an arrangement view similar to the one that we have on our timeline where we can put our tracks in, and another one that looks kind of like this for a mixer. We do have mixing abilities down here, because mixing refers to setting a balance, adjusting our volume levels, creating something that sounds nice when we put all the elements together, and we can do that here. So these are our faders. This allows me to turn the sound up and down. If I double click it, it goes back to 0. But this section up the top here works a little bit differently in Ableton to any other DAW. Normally, if you're used to analog workflows, this is where you'd expect to put effects in. So you'd say, okay, well, this is my vocal, so I want to put an EQ and turn the highs up or down. I want to compress that signal and, add other effects onto it. In this case, these are actually little slots for you to drag and drop samples. So I can actually grab samples from over here and drag and drop them into here and play them back, kind of like a digital version of some like drum machines and little racks where I can trigger samples to play back. What we're going to be doing today, we're going to be assuming you want to create sounds and create samples in a more traditional kind of workflow on the timeline. So we're not going to play around with that. once you've created loops or things that you really like, you can drag and drop them back into this window to test them out. And I'll show you how to do that later on. But that's not a focus for us for today. So just to have a little bit of a look, first thing I want to do is I want to put a software instrument in. So I want to move back to my arrangement view. Shortcuts are your best friend if you can learn them. So pressing tab on your keyboard will drop you over back to this screen. I want to have a look for an instrument. Now, I, on this system, am not running the full complete version of Ableton. I don't have every plugin on here. If you've got the trial, you will see more on this list than what you see on my computer. And if you have the basic version, you might see less than what I've got. I'm the one in the middle. So if I want to find an instrument on here, let's say, for example, that I want an organ, I can search up in this top bar and it will then give me different choices to play with. So in my instrument rack and in the sampler, this is one where we put samples into it. Have a look in here. Ooh, house organ. Cool. Now, before I click this, you can see down here that there's this little blue indicator. That tells me that as soon as I click on any of these, we're going to hear a sample of it. We're going to hear what it could sound like. So let's click it. Cool. So that's going to give us a little taste. What's useful about that is now I can use my up and down arrows to cycle through and find something that I like. Can even press enter, move into my other folders. Ooh, that's cool. Yeah, that one's cool. If I wanted to flick through and I didn't want to hear them, just deselect that little guy. I'll turn it off. Awesome. Okay, so now that we've got this, I'm going to grab it and drag and drop it over onto one of these MIDI channels. What that's going to do is it's going to rename the track. There we go. Beautiful. It's renamed the track. It's also already record enabled this channel. It's told it to send its output out to the master, which is my master channel down, hiding down the bottom down there. And it's automatically listening to the ins. So what I should see is if I press something, I can see that there is a MIDI signal being triggered in there, just that tiny little light that's coming up. You can also see it on this view too. Awesome. Ooh, it's very weird. That's fun. Okay, so what I might do is just create a little loop. You can see that we've got this little 4-bar loop section ready to roll here. If I create and drag that out, so long as it's selected, we're starting to create a little loop. And if I also press this little guy, this is my loop to turn on and off. I can also do that by pressing Command L. That'll turn that loop section on and off. What that means now is it's just going to go round and round in that little 4-bar section. And I can play a heap of stuff until I get a feel for something that feels correct and feels right. Just a creative process at the end of the day. So I'm just going to round that tempo down to 80 so that we're working with an even number. I'm going to press spacebar to play back, and then I'm going to hear that tempo come through because we've got that metronome selected. So that's kind of cool. I'm just playing with ideas. I can test stuff out. Let's record something in. Cool. So you see that looped back around in there. If I want to, I can always grab this and drag it back out. Whoops. Not quite like that. There you go. I should be able to grab this one down here. Drag it back. Beautiful. So now that's a neat little 4-bar loop if I just drag it to the right little section. If I now press spacebar, press play, we missed that first note. I'll show you why. Cool, but we heard it the second time round. Reason for that, if I double click on it, you can see just ever so slightly. I'm just too early. See this little part in here? I'm using the scroll wheel on my mouse and holding down Option and Command to zoom in. See how it starts just before that loop there? If I drag that back in, it will now start, because that MIDI doesn't get triggered if it actually starts a little bit too early. Cool, we got an idea. I'm not trying to create a masterpiece, just trying to show you the basics. Okay, so you can see my timing's not too bad. I'm a little bit early on some of these hits. Some of these ones are a little bit late. Now, depending on the genre, sometimes you want to be a little bit off the grid to make it feel more human, but for some genres we want to be right on that grid. So what I can do is I can do a process called quantizing to essentially lock these MIDI notes onto the grid. We can quantize lots of stuff, but in this case we're working with MIDI. So if I press Command A, I'll select all of those clips that are in this audio file, or in this MIDI clip rather, sorry, all of these notes in this MIDI clip. And if I right click just to show you the options, Command U will quantize just to whatever settings you've previously had set. Most of the time that's probably going to work pretty well. So if I do Command U, there you go. Working pretty well. But if I instead wanted it to quantize to a smaller or a bigger grid, see how that moves things in a slightly different way. Depending on the timing of your track and how intricate your pattern is, you might want to change some of those settings. So just know that you can jump in. If you want it to be more or less sensitive, you can set those in there. Okay, so that's our first element done. I want to put some sort of percussion on here. So you can build your own drum rack. You can also add in samples. We can also jump in and search through our drums. You'll see here that there's a whole heap of already pre-built drum kits. Again, if I select one, there'll be a little sample down here and I can press that little listen. Great. I can do the same thing and I can also just cycle through with my arrow keys. Great. Let's say we want to use that one. So now, boom, boom, ba. Whoops. That's me pressing the wrong button. Accidentally just pressed enter and that popped the dry session kit over the top of this track. I want to make sure it goes onto its own track. Beautiful. Okay, so if I press beautiful. Hopefully the sound coming through to you is a little bit better than it is for me because I've got a bit of delay happening in my ears, but you get the gist anyway. Okay, so first things first, you've got this little kit here. You can see there's a kick, snare, a few snare options, cowbell, toms, hi-hats. If I press my MIDI keyboard right now on its first C note, you can see it's actually triggering this crash up the top. And if you look at this little grid down here, see it's triggering the absolute top part. But if I move down an octave, I can actually, or move up octaves, you can see, watch this little section. As I move down octaves. See, we're moving down, so that big strip is essentially every note that we could be playing in this system. So if I move down an octave and I get my kick, cool. Everything's a little bit rattly here, but we get the idea. Awesome. So what I want to do now is play a little beat. I'm going to use that click track. I'm just going to test out some ideas. I'm not going to hit record, but I'm going to show you how I'll get them back after. So imagine that you're just playing around along to the track that you're creating, testing out some ideas. This is one way that we work with it. So I'm just going to press spacebar. So that's rough, definitely stuffed up some parts in there, but I had an idea kind of playing around. Now that I did that and I wasn't recording, in most other softwares, that's a real pain because you've now lost that. You've got to try and figure it out. But this little button up here, Capture MIDI, as you can see down in that little description down the bottom, it says, click here to capture the MIDI notes you just played. New clip containing the phrase you played will be created on every monitored MIDI track. So right now, the only one that I have monitored is this drum over here. So if I press that, wahoo, I get this little clip, and I'm again gonna drag it up beyond there, drag it back across that clip, load it up. It's relatively on the grid, it's not perfect, definitely needs some fixing. Cool. It's a bit wobbly, but we can fix that. So what I'm going to do now is, again, select all of those, press Command U, woo, snap them to the grid. I don't think that's quite doing what I want, so let's go back in, quantize settings, take that back up. See how it moved them all way too far? There we go. Great. That's all pretty good. I'm missing that one little hi-hat there. I want another one. So I'm just going to grab this hi-hat, hold down Option, and drag it back, and I've just duplicated it. So you can duplicate and create multiples of those little MIDI files on there. Okay, so now that we've got that, I'm going to turn that metronome off because I've got my own drums. I don't need your metronome, Ableton. The one other little thing to note is because I played this on my MIDI keyboard, this is the velocity. So this is essentially like how loud the sample is going to play back, or if you've got an interesting software instrument, it also might change samples. So if you imagine that I have a guitar and I play it really, really softly, and then I hit that same string really, really loud, the whole sound of that guitar is going to be quite different. If you have a really good software instrument, it's actually going to have different audio files that it's playing back if you hit it quietly or if you hit it loud to make it sound more real. And velocity is really useful to play that back. So that variation in velocity there is what makes it sound a little bit more human. That's the thing that you lose if you're using your keyboard, your mouse, your computer keyboard. You lose that functionality. So, yeah, you can always add it back in, and you could jump in here, highlight all of these clips, and we could start adding some randomization. So say, oh, I want to randomize all of that by 11 points. Woo, and then it spreads it all out. That's also kind of cool. And that changes the feel a bit. But it's a different kind of idea. So little things to be aware of. The other thing is now I want to start duplicating this out so I can start building a better arrangement. As soon as you start grabbing a clip, like a clip in here, so a little MIDI clip or an audio clip, you want to make sure that if you're duplicating it, it is exactly the right amount, like 4 bars or exactly 8 bars. We normally work in 4s, 8s, 12s, 16s. But if it's slightly off, right? Imagine you've zoomed all the way in. Wow. Me forgetting my shortcuts after moving from software to software. If that was slightly off, right? Just that little bit. That now means that if I was to go Command D and duplicate it, by the time we're at the 9th bar, it's even further off. Duplicate it again. Even more out of time. Even more out of time. And we're drifting away from that tempo, which now means that those drums are out of time. Everything gets real loopy real quick. So making sure that your clip is the right length is really important. Oh, it's also me trying to use Pro Tools shortcuts on here. Cool. There we go. Beautiful. So before I accidentally forget that, let's make sure that that's on that grid. Beautiful. Okay, so we've got a couple little clips in here. Let's add a bass line. So we may as well, hey? I don't actually need these audio tracks right now. So if I select them, I can select and I can hold down Shift to select more than one. I can just delete them. I could just press delete on my keyboard. Let's add one more bass and then we'll talk a little bit about mixing. So again, go to Instruments, go to Bass. Let's find something nice and warm. Ooh. I like that guy. He's real fun. So now if I just drag it down the bottom, because I haven't got a track, it'll create one. Beautiful. And it's very fun. Okay, let's have a play with this, get a feel. I'll do. Bit rough around the edges, but again, it's all good. Okie doke. Now let's check that that plays back. If I want to be lazy, I can always just highlight it, press Command U. Whoa, that moved it massively. If it moves too far, I know already these settings are not correct. That's better. Oh my goodness, it's too loud. So now, jump back into here, I want to pull that volume level. Great. Okay. So now let's say that we've got, typically, track would be a little bit more complex than just 3 layers, but for sake of time, let's say that that's all we're going for. I want to now start creating an arrangement. So if I duplicate these parts out, I can start to build something that feels a little bit more like a song. And then maybe to make it even more interesting, if I duplicate this bass channel, right click, duplicate, or just select the track and press Command D, maybe for this second half, I want to change it and make it sort of layered. I could select all of these files. I'm going to take these, they're starting on a G. I'm going to move them up to the next G. Woohoo! And again, just quantize in case I've moved it by accident. Now, when we get to this section, we're going to hear both a lower bass line and then a copy of that at a higher register, so it'll sound a little bit thicker, a bit more different. So let's listen to that first, what is that? Yeah, we'll start it from there. That first 30 seconds, get a feel for what this arrangement sounds like now. that's something. This doesn't sound super interesting in that little section that I made because they're pretty much the same. But I reckon if I change this one to a different bass, it'll sound really interesting. So let's find a different one. That could actually be quite fun. Let's see what that sounds like. So now I'll just drop my cursor into this little point here. And now we're playing back from that spot. Terrible. Maybe it's not a bass. Maybe it's something different. Maybe just an 808. Do that. Whatever. Hardly hearing it through this stream setup, but either way, you get the idea. Cool. Okay, so we've created something. Now we want to play around and do some balancing or some processing. So let's say this organ, I like the sound of it, but I want to change it. When we start looking at audio effects, it is a much bigger conversation to get into what each of these audio effects does in an intro to Ableton session, but EQ, equalizer, it's basically like what you've done in a car stereo, changing your highs, your mids, your lows, but a bit more intricate. Dynamics is your difference between the loudest sound and the quietest sound. So do we want to squash that and make everything a little bit more even so that there's less super quiet and less super loud sounds and they're all a bit more balanced? We would use a compressor to do that. Or do we want to make a bigger difference? Are there some loud sounds that we want and there's some quiet sounds that we want to get rid of? In that case, maybe we want to use a gate where we keep the loud sounds and we make the quiet sounds even quieter and we extend that dynamic range. That's a gate or an expander. Drive and color, like distortions, gritty textures, adding harmonics. Modulators is mostly using delay. That's where we get our chorus, phaser, flanger, all these washy kind of effects that are really fun. But let's start with something super simple. If I go into my EQs, you see here you get a few different options. EQ3, EQ8, that's how many different points of control you get on it. If you want to use a template, by all means drop into here and it will give you a whole series of presets. If you want to just use the basic one, grab the whole thing and drag this down onto this timeline down here. So this is, I'm currently on this channel. I've added an EQ and now if we solo it, so we're just listening to that, which I already have. I can shape that and try and find the sound that I like. I actually want to shelf off some of those extra high frequencies, make it a bit more subtle. If you want to do your classic EDM break. Then we start looking at automation, which is pretty easy, to be honest. It's as long as nothing else is record enabled in your session, keep it really simple. I can just do this. I can just say record that. And then stop. And now whenever I play that bit back, it'll repeat it. Get the basic idea. Or if I open up this little timeline down here, this little button, which you can press A on your keyboard to open up and hide, that's your automation timeline. So right now it is controlling on the EQ8 plugin or audio effect. I am changing frequency A of the 8th section down here. So you can manually just draw that line in if you want. Put a little dot, put another little dot, bloop, draw it back down. So now in the middle of that track, we've got some EQ happening. We've got a variety of different elements. Just to show you a little bit of option, I'm going to pull up some samples. So if I look at samples in here, I can search by instrument, or I can also search by key. All of these notes that I've been playing G, I've been playing D, and I've been playing B. So I would assume, like, it's a little bit tricky without doing anything more complicated, but I'm working in the key of G, and I'm working in the key of generally G major based on the notes that I've chosen. Not doing a big music theory thing. But now, because I know I started with the G, if I search for G, M, or just G generally, I should be able to minimize some of my responses down in here. Potentially. Maybe not. The other thing that we can also do is search for 80. And you're going to get lots in here that are like 80s or 808s. But we sometimes will end up with things that actually say like the BPM. There you go. So there's one. So that file should be the correct BPM. We can always change that and adjust it. So if I drag and drop this guy in, awesome. That's pretty cool. If I double click on that audio file, you see right now it's clicked on this little warp button, which means that if warp is on and I tweak that tempo and make it slower or faster, it's going to automatically adjust this for me. It's pretty good. The further you go with it though, faster or slower, the more glitchy kind of sounds that you'll get in there. Most of the time, so if you slow things down, it sounds a little bit worse. Key thing you want to know though is sometimes you don't want it to warp. In that case, you want to turn it off, but you do want to make sure you set whatever its original BPM was. That way, now, if I stretch the track, everything's out of time. Generally, warp is pretty, not 820, yikes. Generally, warp's quite functional and quite useful, but the more you get into it, there'll be a reason why you, on one track, might not want to. Cool. Okay, so then if you start downloading samples and adding elements in, you'll end up with your own sample library and things to seek. If you also have plugins that you've downloaded from third-party providers, those will show up under plugins rather than audio effects. So I got lots of fun, weird gadgets to play with in here, but they're not things that come with Ableton by default. Yeah, I think the only other thing to mention is by default the session sets you up with a reverb channel and a delay channel. These are, you can see here it's labeled A and B. Each of your channels here has a send going out to A or B. That's how much of this send or sound do you want to send into the reverb. So if you think about reverb, reverb's the sound coming back from the room. Do I want there to be lots of sound of, essentially it makes things sound further away. So if I have a lead vocal, I probably want a little bit of reverb on it. And if I've got backing vocals, I probably want a little bit more reverb on those backing vocals. It's always with a grain of salt. There'll be a reason why you don't want to do it that way. But if we want to, say, send this into the reverb, just so you can just hear that one, let's send it up to A. Then as I stop it, you see you get that big tail coming down there. Takes a little bit longer. Same with the drums. Obviously, if you want to change that reverb, double click onto it, jump in here, tweak some settings, or just jump up into here. You can always choose different presets in here if you want it to sound like a little garage. Put that on. pretty tight. You've also got a delay. You can also play with the settings in here equally. You can jump up, go to your delay, change the type of delay that you're working with, and that's that B send. It'll die out after a little while. So there's lots of stuff to play with, lots of things to kind of just get ideas flowing. Once you're happy with your track, first thing you want to do is see how the master track here is peaking. Big no, we don't want that. It's no good to just turn it down here either. You got to turn down the stuff going into it, right? So if you imagine this is it's a good analogy. There's lots of different ones, but essentially this is capping out. There's way too much signal getting into it, and that means that if we turn that down, it's still distorting. It's still receiving too much signal. So we need to turn down what's going into it so that it's got some headroom to move, and then we're not cutting off the top of our audio file. So easiest way of doing that is if I select all of my channels, so select one over here, hold down Shift, select the other, and then pull those faders down. Now we got a healthy amount of level over here. Mastering, getting your level ready for release, whole other concept. This is just getting you set up, ready to make some music. So let's say that we're happy with that track and we want to print it out. This takes a second to sort of finish up. It's a bit of a tail on that. So what I'm going to do is select probably out to about here. I'm going to select the whole way down the track. So that's my starting spot. Delete that. Cool. Let's go from here. It's a bit quieter, but that's okay. Just check it all sounds good. It's very weird, but you know. I think that's all pretty perfect, just to do a little quick test with, apart from, just to make it fun, I want this to go back up again at the end. So let's hear what that sounds like from about there. Oh, it's me clicking the wrong button. Don't worry about it. Sweet, that's a fun little ending. Okay, so I'm going to select that whole track back down to here. Beautiful. And now I'm going to export it. So I'm going to go Command R. Nope, that's rename. Command Shift R. And I can choose which track I want to export. So I could do all the individual tracks. This is especially useful if you're moving it across to a different software. So moving it to Pro Tools to go and work on it further, or collaborating with someone. I just want to do the whole track. I just want an export of this so I can listen to it. Do I want to include the return and master effects? Yeah, because I've got reverb happening. Do I want to render it as a loop? No, but that's really useful if you're doing sound for game design or something that needs to play continuously in a loop. I don't need to convert it to mono. I've got stereo information in there that I want to keep. I don't need to normalize it. I don't need an analysis file. A PCM file is pulse code modulation. It's like a full copy high-res file. I want that. A WAV file is good. I can also get it to do an MP3 at the same time. And then I'm going to say export. And then it's going to say, where do you want to put it? Oh, here's all of my sessions. I'm just going to drop it onto my desktop for the time being, and I'm going to label it as my tutorial track. Awesome. And that's going to take a second to render. And get myself my session open here so we'll see it come onto my desktop. Beautiful. So we can see on here, I've got a tutorial track and an MP3, both created now. That's the time now. And if I press spacebar to play it back on a Mac, cool. That all works. Cool. And then the other backup is actually backing up the session because we haven't even saved this, which is terrible, terrible management. I'm going to save my live set and let's pop that back into my Ableton sessions folder. So let's call this our tutorial track. Pop it in Ableton sessions. Hit save. It's going to rename it up on here. It's in its own folder. And if I have a little look in here, in Ableton sessions, in tutorial track project, there we go. So this folder here, if you're going to go and back this up onto a onto Google Drive or onto a hard drive, you want to take that whole folder because that's got all of the information in it. So I would normally right click, compress that so that it's zipped into its own new zip file. Much better for uploading because then you're not doing a whole folder. And then you can share that, move it around, load it up. One crucial thing to be aware of with Ableton is, you can see down here it says a new update is available. If you want to move from one software or one version to another, it is not a cross compatible software. So if you are moving from version 11.1 to 11.2, those files will not be compatible with each other, which is a real pain. You can't also save back to an older version, which is really challenging. So if you are working in a newer version, you want to make sure that you're working on the same version on multiple computers. It's one weird little thing to be aware of. But other than that, that's the basics and an intro to Ableton as a concept. Obviously, millions more things to look at, but if you're just wanting to open it up and just kind of get started with playing around and creating some sound, that's the first jumping off point that I would suggest. Yeah, if you've got any specific questions, let me know. But otherwise, hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Cheers.